The Dark Knight is one of Final Fantasy's most iconic jobs, but the franchise has never been consistent about what it actually means. Some Dark Knights sacrifice their own health to destroy everything in front of them. Others are tragic villains consumed by forces they can't control. Today, I'm breaking down every single Dark Knight in Final Fantasy history, starting with the one who technically came first, but barely counts, Leon. Here's the thing about Leon from Final Fantasy II. He's the first Dark Knight in the entire franchise, and he doesn't even play like one. 0 HP sacrifice abilities, 0 self-harming mechanics, 0 darkness moves. He's a Dark Knight in title only. Leon serves as both a playable ally and the Emperor's right-hand enforcer, which sounds fascinating until you realize his darkness is purely transactional. He didn't get corrupted. He looked at the Emperor's offer of power and said, yeah, that works for me. Pragmatism, not tragedy. And his arc never really resolves. Leon's allegiance shifts, the story moves on, and his fate just kind of hangs there. He's a rough draft of a concept the series hadn't figured out yet, but that rough draft was necessary because the next character would take everything Leon was missing and turn it into one of gaming's most iconic transformations. Cecil Harvey. Cecil Harvey is the Dark Knight. Not a notable example. He is the template every single entry on this list is measured against, and most of them know it. Here's the thing about Cecil. His fall into darkness wasn't dramatic. There was no deal with a devil, no forbidden ritual. He just followed orders. He served the King of Baron with absolute loyalty, believing he was protecting his homeland, and by the time he realized he'd been committing atrocities for a corrupted ruler, the damage was already done. His darkness came from obedience, which is, not ideal, but the mechanics are where it gets really interesting. Cecil's signature darkness ability hits every enemy on the field at the cost of his own HP. The 3D remake changes the formula, doubling his attack damage but draining health continuously. Either way, the message is the same. Every fight Cecil wins as a Dark Knight kills him a little. His best weapon, the Deathbringer, can inflict instant death on enemies, and yet the guy swinging it is the one bleeding out. The game literally punishes you for using his strongest tools. And then, halfway through Final Fantasy IV, something happens that almost never occurs in RPGs. Cecil permanently, irreversibly transforms into a paladin. This isn't a job switch you can undo. It's a spiritual rebirth. The 3D remake makes it even more explicit by forcing you to fight Cecil's dark side as an actual boss on Mount Ordeals. His shadow manifests, attacks him, and he has to overcome it through gameplay, not cutscenes. He eventually becomes King of Baron. The man who blindly served a corrupt king becomes the king himself. Cecil invented the DNA every other Dark Knight inherits: the HP sacrifice, the self-destructive power fantasy, and the question of whether someone defined by darkness can choose light. But if Cecil proved it was possible, the next entry on this list proves it's never that simple. Zid every Dark Knight before Zod has the same basic deal. Darkness is a problem. It's a disease, a corruption, a phase you need to grow out of. Cecil literally climbs a mountain and fights his own shadow just to stop being one. And then Final Fantasy XI introduces this guy who looks at the entire Dark Knight concept and goes, no, actually I'm good. Z doesn't fall into darkness. He walks into it, sets up a chair, and starts teaching classes. He's the mentor who initiates players into the Dark Knight job, which completely reframes what darkness means in this franchise. It's not a curse to be lifted, it's a martial art to be mastered, and his combat reflects that philosophy perfectly. As a trust, his moveset includes heavy hitters like Scourge and Quietus, abilities that channel darkness as pure offensive force. Where Cecil bleeds health into the void like he's paying rent to the darkness, Zide weaponizes it with zero hesitation. His absorb type spells combine damage with tactical disruption, turning him into a predator rather than a martyr. The guy even shows up as a summonable alter ego during anniversary campaigns, which is basically the game saying, yeah, this is the benchmark. Zide needs no redemption arc because he never fell. He chose darkness consciously, built a functional life around it, and proved that the archetype doesn't require tragedy, which is a nice thought. But the next Dark Knight on this list chose darkness for a very different reason, and it definitely wasn't self-improvement. Gofford Gafgarian. Most Dark Knights on this list have some kind of excuse. A curse, a tragic past, a cosmic injustice. Gafgarion has none of that. He's just a guy who realized atrocity pays well. Known as the Black Bull, Gafgarion is a mercenary fell knight in Final Fantasy Tactics, a job class the original PlayStation translation straight up called Dark Knight. He was a division commander in the Order of the Eastern Sky until they expelled him for barbarism during the 50 Years' War. Not reassigned, expelled, which means he crossed lines that even a military organization during a 50-year conflict thought were too much. But here's the thing, Gafgarion didn't spiral after that. He pivoted. He took his reputation for ruthlessness and turned it into a business model, hiring himself out to whoever paid the most. His loyalty was a subscription service, and the billing cycle was short. He enters the story as Ramza's ally. Then his contract changes hands, and he turns on you without a second thought. No dramatic monologue, just business. And that's exactly what destroys him. Once his employers no longer need him, he's discarded. No allies, no loyalty earned, no one coming to save him. He built his entire identity around being useful to powerful people. And the moment that utility expired, so did he. But if Gafgarion's darkness is uncomfortable because it's voluntary, wait until you meet a Dark Knight whose darkness is literally you, Frey Maiste. When you first meet Frey of the Onyx Shade, everything checks out. Dark armor, massive greatsword, mysterious backstory. He shows up in your level 30 Dark Knight quests, fights alongside you, and generally acts like every mentor character you've ever seen in an MMO. You train together, you bond, you learn the ways of darkness from this brooding warrior who clearly knows more than he's letting on. But here's where it gets complicated. Frey isn't real, he's you. The entire time, Frey has been a manifestation of the Warrior of Light's own repressed darkness, a psychological projection the game calls esteem. He's your Jungian shadow given a sword and a bad attitude. And the game doesn't just hint at this, it confirms it through one killer detail most players miss. Frey's gender in the quest journal changes to match your character's gender. Female character, female Frey. Male character, male Frey. Because he was never a separate person. He was always the part of yourself you refused to look at. This is the moment the Dark Knight archetype stopped being a combat class and became genuine psychological storytelling. The resolution isn't about defeating your inner darkness or purging it through sheer willpower. It's about accepting it, integrating it. At level 70, Frey returns fully embracing the Dark Knight role, fighting as the thing you finally stopped pretending doesn't exist. The FF14 community considers this the most psychologically sophisticated Dark Knight storyline in the franchise. And honestly, it's hard to argue. No other entry on this list turns the mirror on the player quite like this. But if Frey is what happens when a Dark Knight looks inward, Sidurgu is what happens when one looks outward. Sidurgu Oral. If Frey Maiste is the darkness inside your head, Sidurgu is the darkness that the world put there. You find him in Ishgard's Forgotten Night Tavern, sitting with a quiet Elezen girl named Riel, muttering curses at the temple knights under his breath like a man composing a very specific hit list. And honestly, he's got his reasons. Sidurgu of the Obsidian Heart picks up where Frey left off in the Dark Knight questline, but his darkness isn't psychological, it's political. The Temple Knights represent an entire system built on oppression, and Sidurgu has decided that system needs to burn. His rage is aimed directly at the people hurting Riel, a girl who may have ingested dragon blood, which in Ishgard is basically a death sentence. That detail complicates everything. If Riel has been touched by dragon corruption, then Sidurgu isn't just protecting an innocent child, he's protecting someone the entire city would call a monster. He doesn't care. He'll fight the whole institution if he has to. Here's where it gets interesting. His character model was actually used as one of 3 primary Dark Knight representations before Heavensward even launched. The developers wanted players to see this guy and immediately understand what a Dark Knight could be. Not a brooding loner, a man using dark methods against a corrupt system because nobody else will. Over time, his cynicism softens. He stops fighting out of pure rage and starts fighting because Riel needs him to. Whether that makes him a hero or just a well-intentioned extremist, the game never fully answers, which is exactly the point. But if you think Sidurgu's moral ambiguity is complicated, wait until you meet a man who spent 2,000 years becoming the villain because the gods told him he couldn't be the hero. Arden Izunia. Most Dark Knights choose darkness. Arden Lucis Calum had it injected into his soul by the gods themselves, and then they locked the door and threw away the key. Here's the thing about Arden. His real name isn't Izunia. He's a Lucis Calum, same bloodline as Noctis, and he was originally a healer. He absorbed demons into his own body to cure people of the Star Scourge, sacrificing himself to save others. And for that act of selfless consciousness, the crystal rejected him, the astrals condemned him, his soul got trapped, and he was cursed with immortality he never asked for. So when he shows up as Chancellor of Niflheim ruining lives, that's not a man who fell to darkness. That's a man who got shoved into it by cosmic forces and decided if the universe wanted a villain, he'd give them one worth remembering. In episode Arden, his combat makes this painfully literal. His shadow step closes gaps at terrifying speed, and his finishing attacks transform enemies into demons he drains to keep fighting. But the standout mechanic is this: his HP can hit 0, and he keeps going. He only fails if he gets hit again while in that state. The health trade-off that defines the entire archetype becomes meaningless when you literally cannot die, which is, you know, not ideal. The divine forces even conjure a vision of Era, the woman he loved, specifically to torture him into submission. He watches it happen and doubles down on revenge instead. No breaking, no bending, just centuries of accumulated rage pointed directly at the gods who made him. And even after Noctis destroys him, his soul remains trapped in the beyond. No peace, no release, just eternal darkness with zero possibility of escape. Arden is what happens when you take the Dark Knight concept and remove the off switch entirely. But if Arden is a Dark Knight who can't die, the next one on our list is a man so obsessed with killing chaos that he forgot everything else, including his own name, Jack Garland. Jack Garland doesn't choose darkness. He doesn't fall into it. He wakes up inside it with zero memory of how he got there and an overwhelming need to kill something called chaos. That's it. That's the whole personality. Here's the thing: a dark crystal was used to deliberately erase Jack's memories, specifically to prevent emotions that might cause him to succumb to chaos. His darkness wasn't earned through trauma or chosen through desperation. It was engineered. Somebody looked at this man and said, you know what would make him more effective? Remove his entire capacity for choice, which is, you know, not ideal, and his combat reflects this perfectly. Most Dark Knights sacrifice their own health to deal damage. Jack skips that step. His soul burst ability lets him shatter weakened enemies outright, absorbing their energy to fuel his own power. He doesn't pay the cost. Other people do. He turns beings into resources and consumes them. It's the Dark Knight health economy stripped of nobility and rebuilt as pure predation. But the real horror is what happens after. Jack's transformation into Garland, his true identity, grants him control over the four crystals, the power to sever the balance between worlds, and the ability to loop time itself. And when he returns to Cornelia, he loses his memories again, retains nothing except the desire to kill chaos. Wake up, kill chaos. Forget, repeat, forever. Every other Dark Knight on this list has at least the possibility of redemption. Jack doesn't, because redemption requires knowing you need it. You can't choose a different path when you don't remember the path exists. His existence is a closed loop of violence with no resolution, no growth, no escape. But if Jack represents darkness without agency, the next entry proves you can walk the dark path and still keep your soul intact. Pain. Every Dark Knight on this list so far has one thing in common: darkness defines them. It's their curse, their discipline, their entire personality. Pain from Final Fantasy X2 looked at all of that and said, yeah, I'll just put it on when I need it. The Dark Knight dress sphere is obtained in the Bevel Underground, and any of the 3 playable characters can equip it. Yuna, Riku, Pain, whoever you want. And then 5 minutes later, none of them are. They just swap to something else. Darkness isn't a spiritual burden, it's an outfit. Mechanically, the dress sphere is solid. Highest HP of all available dress spheres, boosts to defense and magic defense, access to darkness and the Arcana skill set with bio and death spells. The tools are all there, but the weight behind it, gone. You can literally take it off and go be a songstress. Pain herself has a genuinely compelling arc, uncovering her past, dealing with betrayal, figuring out where she belongs in a post-Sin world, real character development, but zero of it connects to being a Dark Knight. That journey happens completely independent of whatever she's wearing. This has divided fans for years. Cecil nearly destroyed himself. Frey literally was the darkness inside you, and Pain just, you know, puts on the armor when the fight calls for it. Some appreciate the flexibility, arguing not every interaction with darkness needs to be an existential crisis, which is fair, but it raises an uncomfortable question about whether the Dark Knight means anything when it's temporary. And if Pain represents darkness as a costume, costume, the next entry takes us to someone for whom it's anything but removable. Graham. Most Dark Knights sacrifice their health to deal damage. Graham sacrifices himself to absorb it. That distinction changes everything. Graham shows up in Final Fantasy Dimensions during the second chapter, cloaked in heavy onyx armor, looking exactly like the kind of guy who has zero interest in small talk. At first, he reads like every other brooding dark warrior in Final Fantasy, but he's not. Here's the thing, Graham's fall into darkness didn't come from ambition or corruption. An invasion wiped out everything he knew, everyone he cared about, gone. That kind of loss doesn't leave room for heroism, it leaves room for armor, both literal and emotional. What makes Graham unique is what he does with that darkness. He channels it into protecting Nacht, the son of his dead friend. His abilities still cost massive HP to activate, because that's what being a Dark Knight means. But he can also draw enemy attacks toward himself, functioning as a dark tank who bleeds so a child doesn't have to. And then there's his ending. Graham doesn't die, he doesn't get redeemed, he gets transformed into a sword. A literal weapon, his entire physical form transmuted into an object of protection. He stops being a person and becomes a tool, which is, not ideal. Graham loved someone enough to actually physically become a weapon for them. That is the most haunting ending of any Dark Knight on this list, and nobody talks about it because Final Fantasy Dimensions flew under everyone's radar. But if Graham's story is about love turning a man into a weapon, the next entry is about something far less noble turning a king into a monster. Astos is fascinating specifically because of what he doesn't have. No redemption arc, no internal struggle, no crisis of conscience. He's the evil king of the Dark Elves in the original Final Fantasy, encountered as a boss in the Western Keep, and he predates the formalized Dark Knight job class entirely. He's not a warrior wrestling with darkness. He is the darkness, just a wall you walk into. And honestly, that simplicity is kind of refreshing. His signature move is the Death Spell, which eliminates party members with near guaranteed success. Just instant removal from the fight. No build up, no dramatic wind up, just gone. He backs that up with Slora, Fira, and Thundara, making him genuinely threatening for a game released in 1987. But there's zero complexity to his motivation. He's evil. He knows he's evil. He's comfortable with it, which is, not ideal for the Warriors of Light, but at least he's honest about it. Here's where it gets interesting though. In 2022, Stranger of Paradise Final Fantasy Origin reimagined Astos as the main antagonist, and suddenly this one-dimensional boss had layers. His new version involves the Lufenians, transforming him from a simple obstacle into a thematic exploration of manipulation and control. 35 years later, the franchise looked at its simplest dark character and said there's something here worth digging into. That contrast between 1987 Astos and 2022. Astos might be the single best measure of how far the Dark Knight concept has evolved, but if Astos represents where dark power started in this franchise, the next entry shows what happens when that power gets handed to someone with actual magical authority. Doga. So after 11 Dark Knights whose stories span corruption, redemption, ruin, and transcendence, we arrive at one who sits in a strange gray area. And I don't mean that metaphorically. Doga appears in Final Fantasy III as a powerful sage and student of the great Magus Noah, and he's someone players have debated belonging on this list for years. Here's the thing, unlike every other entry, Doga cannot be definitively categorized as a Dark Knight. He's a black mage of immense power who willingly lets the party kill him so his soul can unlock the path to the dark world. Did he sacrifice himself to stop darkness? Absolutely. Did he wield dark power in ways that mirror the archetype? You could argue it. Is he technically a Dark Knight? No. Not even close. And honestly, that's kind of perfect. In a list defined by warriors who bleed themselves dry in combat, Doga is the sage who walked right up to the edge of that archetype and stopped just short. He chose darkness not as a weapon, but as a doorway. We've spent this entire video pulling back curtains. Cecil's transformation, Arden's eternal curse, Frey's revelation that the darkest night was inside you all along. But Doga keeps his curtain closed. And maybe that's the most fitting way to end this, because the Dark Knight archetype has spent nearly 4 decades proving one thing, from Leon's foundational ambiguity all the way to Jack Garland's nihilistic transcendence. The most interesting warriors in Final Fantasy have always been the ones fighting themselves, the ones who pay for power and blood, the ones whose greatest enemy isn't some final boss, but the darkness they carry every single day. Doga just happens to be the one standing at the threshold choosing not to cross it. If you enjoyed this video and want to see more, click the video on the screen now.